Hello, botanists! This is our first video for the Wednesday class, Chapter 1. Millions of years ago, plants were similar to now. It was more of a fern situation. I put a dinosaur train episode about ferns in your slides if you would like to revisit the dinosaur train, which I know is how you learned about the Paleolithic time period. So many of those plants were angiosperms that included the grasses, the trees, and the flowers. Angiosperms, by definition, are a plant that flowers and produces seed. So try and keep that in mind. You can see how that's going to probably show up as a multiple choice question. An angiosperm is a plant that flowers and produces seed. Gymnosperms are Christmas trees, and we will talk about those later. So through time, plants evolved partly as the result of climate change, mostly just an evolutionary situation, and you got different plants, things that I love, touch me plants, the corpse flower, pitcher plants. These, I'm fascinated by the things that plants can do. Around 10 to 12,000 years ago, humans began cultivating plants. This dramatically impacted the global system because we were now actually having plants grow in a particular area. We weren't just foraging. So this probably began in tropical and subtropical Middle East and Africa. Plants from the wild were domesticated and cultivated to become the plants we grow and use today. 6,000 to 5,000 years ago, crops were being grown in Mexico and Europe. These were actual crops. So the original corn plant, the teosinte plant, this is what it looked like to begin with. And then the corn plant over on the right is what we have cultivated and domesticated that plant. Through years of selection, we have cultivated a much larger plant that allows us to get more kernels from each plant. As time progressed, urban centers were created. So what this means is food was now brought in from rural areas. So instead of everyone living in a rural area and plants were just equally distributed among all the people that farmed them, we now had crop production areas and cities. So the crop production areas were forced to move further away from the cities, further and further and further away. You can think about Chicago. It's a slightly bigger city than St. Louis. You can also think about St. Louis, although don't have to drive that far to see corn in St. Louis. You can probably drive about 30 minutes in any direction and you can start to see cornfields. Chicago is a little bit bigger, and so you have to drive further out of the center of the city to where you finally see industrialized agriculture, where you could see a cornfield or a soybean field. So as these crop production areas were moved further away from urban areas, that's when you started to see this rural-urban interface. The urban residents lost the knowledge of how to grow crops, and they relied on rural areas, and they didn't always understand how that was grown. They didn't understand why it needed to be a certain price. So you definitely had this split between the urban and the rural areas. You also notice that it feels hotter in the city. If you get out of the city a little bit from the black asphalt and the no trees and go somewhere surrounded by plants, you will find that it's much cooler. Here I just added some pictures. I'm just using Chicago as an example because St. Louis, you don't really actually have to go that far to see corn. But if you can see Chicago up in the top right of Illinois, you can see that you have to go a little ways out of the city of Chicago because the urban areas also expand and take up that farmland. So now you have a rural area where you were able to grow corn, and now that rural area has become an urban area, and you're losing farm ground. At the same time, you're having to truck crops into a city further and further away from the rural interface. Okay, so that's a little history. Now we're going to talk a bit about agronomy versus horticulture. This will certainly come up when you look at multiple choice, and there's some very easy ways to distinguish and some harder ways. Agronomy is the study of field-grown crops. These are the big fields that you see around here. This is going to be cornfields, soybean fields, wheat fields. If you go to the Illinois side and part of the Missouri side, this area is one of the largest producers of pumpkins, and we are the largest producers of horseradish. So those are some interesting agronomic crops. Horticulture is the study of crops that require more intense care, from planting to delivery to the consumer. So horticulture is going to be more your fruits, your vegetables. So even the example of pumpkins could actually go into either space. You could have a horticulturalist growing your pumpkins, or you could have somebody who's an agronomist with your pumpkins. Horticulture basically is fruits, vegetables, and for sure ornamentals. So you would consider, if any of you have ever been to Eckert's, the orchard, that is horticulture. They're growing very intensely apple trees. Most edible horticulture crops can be eaten with little or no processing. If you're processing the food, such as the pie pumpkins we grow in this area, that's considered something not the same as horticulture. That usually is considered field agronomy because there's processing. Horticulture is plants that you would typically grow in a greenhouse, or you would grow very intensely for fruits and vegetables. Okay, the distinction between agronomy and horticulture, again, it's not a sharp line. Some things like turf grass